My son and his wife sent me crashing through a glass door. The pain exploded. I was bleeding. They called it an accident. I sat in that cold kitchen by myself, thinking maybe I had become useless now that the paychecks had stopped. But what they never knew was that I had quietly inherited $21 million. They believed I was down to nothing. What will they do when they learn it could buy and sell everything they own outright in cash? I never expected to see my own blood smeared across the kitchen floor. Not in my son's home. Not at 71. It happened on a Tuesday. Snow had only just begun to fall outside, soft and steady, like the hush that comes before something breaks. Bradley and Juliana had been on edge all morning. I made myself small, the way older women sometimes do when they sense they've worn out their welcome. Juliana stood at the counter, arms folded. Her voice was sharper than usual. "You're still holding on to the deed, aren't you?" She didn't have to raise her voice. The edge in it cut clean enough. I looked at her, then at Bradley. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stood there, picking at his phone like this conversation had nothing to do with him, but it did. It involved all of us. The house still had my name on it, and they didn't like that. I knew they'd been plotting something. Whispers, missing mail, locked drawers. But I kept quiet. I said calmly that I wasn't ready to sign anything, that maybe we could sit down later and talk it through. Maybe after dinner. Juliana didn't wait. She took 2 steps forward and pointed toward the back door. She said I needed fresh air, that I was being emotional, that it would be better if I stepped out. Her hand closed around my arm, not hard at first, but firm. Then something shifted. Bradley, still silent, slid in beside her. I remember his knuckles brushing mine like he meant to help me walk. I remember the tight set of his jaw. The next second, he was falling. My spine hit the glass. A loud, dry crack. Then everything gave way. I landed outside, half in snow, half on splinters. Cold bit my arms. The smell of blood mixed with bitter pine and winter air. For a moment I thought I might never stand up again. But I did. I always do. From inside, Juliana shouted that it was an accident, that I'd lost my balance, that they were only trying to help. But they didn't open the door. They didn't come me to check, not even Bradley. I stood. My hand was bleeding. My coat was ripped. Snow seeped into my shoes. And all I felt was stillness. Not shock, not pain, stillness. Like something inside me had snapped back into place. I turned away and walked down the driveway. Not a single word. It wasn't the first time they'd made me feel like I didn't belong, but it was the first time I saw it clearly. They wanted me gone. They had plans for this house, and in their eyes I was no longer the mother who raised him. I was an obstacle, a signature, a delay. I didn't go to the hospital. I went to the diner on 4th and Maple, slipped into the back booth, ordered coffee with extra cream. The waitress didn't flinch when she saw the blood. She simply handed me a napkin and said, quietly, "Take your time." And I did. That night, while the snow kept falling, I booked a rental car and checked into a motel. My hand still ached, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I knew I had to move carefully, quietly. I wasn't going to scream or beg or play the victim. I was going to do what I've always done best. Observe, think, act. They thought I was weak. They assumed I was finished. But they forgot who built this life in the first place. They forgot who kept food on their table, who paid their college loans, who co-signed their mortgage. They forgot. I didn't. If you're still listening, thank you for staying. Some stories don't open with a smile or a celebration. Some begin with broken glass and the silence afterward. But silence, when chosen, can be powerful, and mine was just beginning. Would you have walked away or stayed? Tell me quietly in your own heart, because the next part, that's when everything began to change. I stayed at the motel for 3 nights. It was the kind of place where the sheets were always cold and the ceiling fan ticked softly, like an old clock running out of time. But it was quiet and no one asked questions. I needed quiet more than comfort. The morning after the glass incident, he rose early. My hand had swollen a little, but I cleaned the wound and wrapped it again. I made myself a list, just 4 things. Simple, measurable things I could control. At the top was one-word proof. I had always trusted my instincts. I spent decades reading people in boardrooms and mediation rooms, cooling conflicts with nothing more than a steady voice and the right choice of words. But this wasn't work. This was my life, my son, my home. The line shad blurred slowly over time, until I couldn't tell if I was living with family or with people waiting for me to leave. I remembered something from a few months earlier. A quiet afternoon when Juliana took the kids to her mother's, and I had the house to myself. I'd installed a small camera back then. Nothing fancy, just a backup. It was tucked in the corner of the bookshelf, disguised as a little ceramic owl. I told no one. I never thought I'd need it. But after the moment at the door, Ick knew. I called the friend who'd helped me set it up, Maya, an old colleague from the hospital network. She worked in compliance and tech security, sharp ace attack, and never asked extra questions. Within hours she recovered the footage and sent it to my private drive. I watched it once. Only once. Bradley's hands, Juliana's voice, the angle, the thud of my body hitting the glass, the vicious snap, then silence. There was no denying it now. This wasn't just hurt feelings. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was assault, and they dressed it in silence and insincere concern. All while eyeing the house I'd paid off 27 years ago. I called a lawyer the next day. Her name was Nadine, a woman in her 50s with a voice like gravel over steel. She didn't ask for drama. She asked for documentation.
I gave her everything.
While she began building a case for elder abuse and property coercion, I started putting the rest of my plans into motion. I visited the bank quietly, withdrew enough to move things fast, but not loud enough to raise flags. Most of my funds were untouched, still tied up in municipal bonds, a private real estate trust, and a separate account linked to a client's old trust, 21 million in total. It had taken years, but it was mine. I'd never told Bradley. He assumed my retirement came from Amadeus pension, that I lived on social security and whatever lingered from his father's account. That assumption kept him comfortable in his entitlement. And Juliana. She never imagined I might be more than what I looked like. Grey hair, soft sweaters, quiet mornings, easy to dismiss. But I had been building something they never bothered to see. I rented a short-term apartment in town under a different name. Just a month-to-month lease, no frills, no noise. I didn't need a view. I needed space to think. The first thing I placed on the counter was a folder. Inside was the footage, a printed copy of the house deed, my living will, and Nadine's first draft of the complaint. Then I sat down, inhaled, and for the first time in years let myself feel everything. The betrayal, the humiliation, the deep ache of being treated as disposable by the very people I'd given everything to. But beneath the ache, something else began to bloom. A quiet resolve. Not to punish, not to destroy, but to claim. Not just my name on a document, not just my house, but my space, my dignity, my place in the world. And I knew this was only the beginning. There was a strange comfort in the hush of my new apartment. The heater hummed softly, traffic whispered from a distant road, and my slippers made a hollow little sound on the kitchen tile. I boiled water for tea, and stood in front of the simple black folder I'd laid on the counter the night before. It looked ordinary, unremarkable, yet everything inside it carried weight. There were 3 documents. The first was a printed copy of the house deed. My name remained there, clear as daylight. No joint ownership, no transfer signatures, nothing surrendered. I had delayed for years, obeying a small tug in my gut that murmured, "Wait." That instinct, that gentle gravity, had saved me. The second document was a ledger of my holdings, not to boast but to keep facts straight. The money had accumulated over decades through quiet, careful investments in long-term care housing, hospital systems, and wellness centres spread across 3 states. Former clients left me gifts in their wills, placed shares in trust, or pressed envelopes of gratitude into the future. I hardly spent. I rarely needed to. Enough was enough, and enough had grown. The third item was a still image from the camera footage, frozen on the exact moment before the fall. My face, my hands lifted, the breath suspended inside my chest. I closed the folder gently. Today I would begin formal filings with Nadine, but before that, I needed a last look backward. I pulled an old notebook from my purse, the green cloth one with softened corners. Over the years I'd used it to capture what didn't fit in conversations, dates, quotes, side remarks, and the tiny observations that never make a scene by themselves. It wasn't the large clashes that built the full picture. It was the small seams, like when the mail began being sorted before it reached the kitchen table, or when Bradley insisted on handling utilities, a task I had always managed without fail. Juliana's questions came wrapped in casual tone but edged with intention. Who would inherit the house? Had I updated my will? What exactly did my papers look like these days? And there were the documents I stopped seeing altogether. The social security statements, the bank envelope that vanished. I once asked about my Medicare card. Juliana said she'd put it somewhere safe. Safe turned into nowhere. In the quiet kitchen of that small apartment, I recognized the feeling I had misnamed as paranoia. It was preparation. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were arranging my disappearance. Tidy, convenient, unremarked upon. I sipped the tea and looked out at the new snowfall. Fine, steady, the way dust settles on abandoned shelves. After breakfast, I dressed with intention. Not vanity. Purpose. Grey trousers, black turtleneck, wool coat. The same one I wore when I signed my first leadership contract at the hospital in 1984. That coat had been in more boardrooms than most junior partners ever dream of. I carried the folder into Nadine's office at exactly 10 a.m. Her assistant, clipped voice, close-cropped hair, guided me into a room lined with legal binders and framed citations. Nadine sat behind a bare desk. No clutter, no photos, just a pen and a yellow legal pad. She didn't trade small talk. She didn't need to. She opened the folder, turned each page, and nodded. It took less than half an hour for her to confirm what my bones already knew. I had a case, not just assault, but financial manipulation, coercion, and willful neglect of a dependent elder. Colorado statutes didn't whisper about this. They spoke plainly. Nadine had stood beside clients in rooms like these before, quietly, without cameras, yet firmly. I asked for sealed action, no public filings, no headlines. I wasn't seeking applause. I was seeking outcome. She agreed. We would move slowly and deliberately, steady steps, clean paper, precise language. By noon, the preliminary affidavit was signed. By 3 p.m, copies of the video were secured in 2 separate locations. By sundown, I was back in the apartment by the window, the folder thinner now but heavier in consequence. Charges would take weeks. A court date might take longer. But the motion had begun, and once the right wheel turns, it's hard to stop. That night I slept lightly. Old aches hummed in new places. My injured hand still trembled at the edges, but I no longer felt small. Not erased, not invisible, just present in my own life again. The people I had raised couldn't, or wouldn't, see me clearly. They saw roles, not person, obstacle, liability, delay. But they didn't know everything. They didn't know funds had been shifted into a holding company. They didn't know the trust was updated, heirs removed until further notice. They didn't know the title they coveted sat inside a revocable trust, legally buffered. Most of all, they didn't know the woman they tried to diminish had already outlined the next chapter without them. It would take a while before they noticed the gaps. Silence, though, has a way of growing loud. 3 days after I left Nadine's office, the phone rang just after 8. Her voice was level and calm, The paperwork was filed. The complaint had entered the court system. She told me not to expect fireworks. These things move on their own schedule, but it had begun. I thanked her and stood very still in my kitchen, letting quiet settle like a promise. That afternoon I drove to a private postal centre on the edge of town. I handed over a sealed envelope. 3 items inside: a copy of the complaint, a formal request through council for the immediate return of all house-related documents, and a notice of restricted contact. Effective at once. The address read Bradley and Juliana. I didn't linger at the counter. I didn't look back in the lot. By the time I returned, snow had thickened, the kind that presses the world down and hushes it like a lid on a pot slowly gathering steam. I opened my notebook to earlier entries, the ones I had once dismissed as too small to matter. Now they formed a pattern. Juliana had accidentally signed for my medical statements 4 months ago. Bradley volunteered to update the online property tax account last winter. They tried to switch my phone plan to save money, and I lost access to my banking app for 2 weeks. Not random, not benign. A strategy of tiny cuts. So I made a new list, not of losses, but of what remained fully mine: the deed, the trust, the footage, the law, and myself. The next morning, Nadine emailed, "Case update. The court set a preliminary review. Nothing public yet, no arrests. But if the pace held, the video would serve as direct evidence and a temporary restraining order could follow." I didn't celebrate. I didn't exhale. I simply felt something align, like vertebrae return to their proper place. That week I met Marcus, an estate planner I trusted from years back when I helped restructure a client's retirement portfolio. Discreet, steady, respectful. He still addressed me as if I sat at the head of a hospital table, even though those days were long behind me. I told him to draw documents to move the bulk of my holdings into a new foundation, a non-profit trust devoted to career retraining and wellness for women over 60, especially widows, especially those who fed families, signed cheques, co-signed dreams, then got pushed to the margins once their usefulness was no longer convenient. Marcus didn't blink. He asked exact questions, mapped timelines, flagged what to move now and what to stage later. I left with a binder of drafts and a calendar of quiet steps. Outside, the sidewalks were slick, and pedestrians shuffled carefully. I walked slowly too, not from fatigue, but because slowness finally felt allowed. That night I pulled out photo albums, not for nostalgia, but for truth-checking. I wanted to see the moments I'd let memory blur, the genuine smiles, the holidays that didn't feel staged. One photograph stayed with me. Bradley at 12 on the hospital lawn, eating the sandwich I'd packed. Hair messy, arm thrown around my shoulders. He wasn't cruel then, just a boy with more feeling than space to sort it. I held the photo a long time. Not to excuse the man, but to remember the path from boyhood to this point, so I could clearly see where we'd arrived. A few days later, a voicemail from Juliana, taut, polished. They had received my attorney's letter, were surprised by the allegations, and hoped to handle this privately. No apology, no regret, just management. More worry about paper than about blood still crystallized in my coat fibers. I didn't respond. Nadine would handle communication now. I wasn't arguing, I wasn't explaining. I prepared. I duplicated every document and stored sets in 3 separate places. I scheduled another meeting with Marcus to finalise the first transfer. I bought a new coat, heavy grey wool for cold walks and long thoughts. The old one, sleeve-stained, I folded into a sealed bag, not to forget, but to honour the seam between before and after. Then I walked. The wind was sharp, but I didn't flinch. My body knew discomfort. My mind was crisp. They thought glass would shatter me. They didn't understand that some breaks are clean, and the woman who steps through comes out honed, not bitter, just exacting. I now had precision, paperwork, patience, and the law. Days passed, and the apartment grew quieter. Snow stacked against the window ledge and swallowed street noise. Each morning, the ritual stayed the same. Tea, documents, walking. A rhythm that kept me focused without letting me sink. On the 5th morning, I drove west into the mountains without telling a soul, not Nadine, not Marcus. Early light, a small bag, my new coat. I booked a cabin under another name, an old habit from shepherding high-profile hospital staff who needed privacy. Some skills never age. The road wound between pines and frozen lakes under a low, steady sky. Aspen by noon, snow heavier there, soft and untouched. The air tasted cleaner than anything I'd breathed in weeks. The cabin was simple. A fireplace, a slope view, a functional kitchen I wouldn't trouble. I hadn't come for leisure. I'd come to breathe, to listen for the parts of me that a noisy house had tried to drown. That evening I slid into the hot springs. The water, almost too warm, steamed in the cold air. I floated longer than I usually allow, not to forget but to empty, to make interior room. At daybreak, wrapped in a blanket on the small deck, I sipped coffee and thought about the woman who used to make tidy excuses for Bradley's sharpness. He's stressed. He's defending Juliana. I must have misunderstood. Those words evaporated the day my back met glass. With clearer eyes, I sketched new outlines, not for depositions but for living without justifying myself to anyone. In town, I stopped at a quiet bookstore I'd once loved. Ruth was still behind the counter and, bless her, remembered me. We didn't say much. I chose books about women who changed their lives late and left without mentioning a single file or hearing. For 3 days, the cabin began to feel like mine, not by deed, but by choice. Reclaiming space, even briefly, changes the shape of your spirit. It's not escape, it's return. That night I wrote letters, not to Bradley, not to Juliana, to myself. Letters to my 40-year-old self who spent birthdays alone when everyone forgot. To 50, who helped buy their first house and wasn't invited to the party. To 60, who quietly paid their credit card debt when they couldn't make minimums. I told each version, you did what you could with what you knew. I forgave her. I thanked her. Those women carried me here, steady enough to walk away, sharp enough to plan, quiet enough to let truth do the heavy lifting. Later, the wind turned fierce. It rattled the windows and reminded me how thin glass is. Still, the fire held, the roof held, and I did not feel unsafe. I felt alert. Morning brought the slick roads home. I took my time, letting each curve show me what came next. Nadine would be preparing the next filing. Juliana would try charm, or outrage dressed as outrage on my behalf. Bradley would do what he does, go wordless, then passive, then simmering. None of that would pull me back to that house, and it would not drag me into an older, smaller version of myself. I drove straight to the building that housed my newly registered foundation. Paperwork had finalised 2 days prior. I hadn't told anyone, not even Marcus. A private beginning. At the front desk, I showed my ID. The receptionist read the name aloud, and I asked her to repeat it so I could hear it land. The Montreux Initiative, support for women over 60 to rebuild, quietly, powerfully, on their own terms. She handed me a welcome packet. I thanked her, walked to the small office set aside for me and sat down. No ceremony, no clapping. But inside, something shifted into place and stayed. Bradley once told me I was too sensitive, that I took everything personally. Now I take things personally on purpose, not out of injury, but out of clarity. After a storm, you discover the path wasn't gone. It was covered. And now I was walking it, sure-footed by myself. The first time I saw Juliana again wasn't in a courtroom. It was at a property showcase. I hadn't planned the encounter, but once you stop controlling every beat, life composes its own music. Her firm was touring newly renovated homes outside Denver. One was a minimalist 5-bedroom with open beams and Scandinavian lines, bankrolled by a private investment group. What Juliana didn't know, the group had a new silent manager, me. I arrived 10 minutes early in a long coat and dark glasses, not to hide but to be left alone. I walked the rooms, listening to her polished voice spin imported tile, radiant floors, and solar rebates into gold. She looked unchanged, perfect hair, firm cadence, sales smile that stopped at the teeth. She caught sight of me and her expression flickered. Composure snapped back like elastic. Her assistant, Chloe, sharp and ambitious, shadowed me, then murmured that this was a private showing. I turned, met her eyes, and handed over a card with the investment firm's name. My name sat beneath it as strategic partner. Her eyes widened, then skittered toward Juliana. I told her I'd be in the sunroom. 10 minutes later, Juliana entered. No greeting. No, why are you here? Just a glance from the card to my face. Beneath the crisp exterior, panic edged her posture. I asked if she'd reviewed the latest sponsorship ledger. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The firm had accepted a bridge loan from a quiet coalition for this very renovation. When I assumed management, I became the quiet centre. Her mind raced. She knew this wasn't coincidence. I told her that paper remembers. Everything circles back. Then I left. No dramatics. The point wasn't confrontation. It was recalibration. Hers. That evening at a small cafe, I sipped black tea while the sky slid to purple. A young waitress asked if I needed anything more. I smiled and said I was fine. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel erased. Later, an email from Nadine. The case had moved from preliminary review into active motion, interviews, depositions, hearings if necessary. A list of sealed evidence now included the video, 2 neighbours' sworn statements about the argument, and a trail showing Bradley's attempts to consolidate my utilities under his name. Slow progress, but solid footing. In the same week, the bank confirmed the first transfer for the Montreux initiative, $5 million set aside for operations and endowment. I exhaled a breath I didn't know I was holding. I wondered what Juliana told Bradley after the showcase, whether she tried charm or delivered the truth unvarnished. It didn't belong to me anymore. What mattered was that their ground had shifted, and I no longer stood in their shadow. Bradley didn't reach out. Silence from him was the loudest thing he could say. Juliana, though, couldn't resist. Nadine forwarded a note from Juliana's counsel, phrases like misunderstandings and emotional misjudgments during a family dispute. They proposed a private resolution, mutual confidentiality, and of course immediate cessation of all pending motions. In other words, a deal. Nadine replied with a single paragraph. The process would proceed. We would speak only through official channels. The thread went dead. Marcus called next. He's not a panicker, but there was a thread of tension I'd never heard. A third-party real estate group had popped up, fishing for ownership details on one parcel tied to my trust. Someone was testing the fence. I asked what he needed from me. He had already handled it. Our spring restructuring had sealed the seams tight. He just wanted me informed. That evening, I sat with the snow drifting outside and thought about desperation disguised as strategy. I pulled an old list, properties Bradley wanted me to co-sign back when he and Juliana were still building. I'd declined. Back then I couldn't name why. I just felt a tug to say no. Instinct had protected me in silence. The next morning Nadine sent notice. Preliminary discovery was closing. The court approved the next step. A pre-motion hearing would be scheduled. With it, evidence would be shared to both sides. The video would no longer live only on a private drive. It would become part of the record. I spent that afternoon walking the Arboretum paths, half-frozen gravel, cold benches. Moving forward while everything else felt paused brought me a strange peace. I thought about my last Christmas in that house, catered food, Bradley's short answers, grandkids glued to screens while my carefully chosen gifts went unopened. I remembered hanging a mirrored ornament and seeing my face warped in the silver curve. I didn't know it would be the last holiday there. In hindsight, I'm grateful. If I'd known, I might have stayed longer out of guilt. And guilt is not a reason to keep bleeding. A week later, a formal notice arrived. Hearing in 2 weeks. No drama, just a judge, a few lawyers, documents and time. Still, it would be the first moment truth would be spoken aloud in a room that writes it down. Meanwhile, life continued. I met with the Foundation's first advisors, women from different corners of the state. Some had buried husbands, some had lost homes, all had been overlooked in rooms that should have seen them. As they spoke, I realised the quiet I endured in that house wasn't the loss of my voice. I'd just been speaking to the wrong audience. Afterward, a woman named Janice approached, soft eyes, steady voice. She said she watched the way I listened, not to reply but to hold space. It was the kindest sentence anyone had offered me in years. That night I opened the old folder again, medical files, financial records, trust copies, the external drive with the video, and placed it into a new fireproof safe I'd had installed the week before. Not just protection, preparation. Bradley and Juliana's grip on the old house had loosened. The bank froze their line of credit. The mortgage review flagged anomalies. Everything that needed to wobble was wobbling. And I had learned that stillness wasn't weakness. It was patience with intention. I was done waiting. It began with a phone call from Nadine on a quiet Thursday morning. Her voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. Not sharp, not hurried, but deliberate, careful. Like each word was being measured before release. She told me the house, my former home, was now officially under investigation. The footage had been reviewed not only by the court but also by a special division focused on elder abuse and domestic assault. They were taking it seriously. That meant officers would conduct a site visit, not just to gather more evidence, but to see the place themselves, to feel the air where it happened, to walk the ground where glass once broke. Juliana, Nadine said, had been the first to call the court that morning, frantic, caught off guard, scrambling. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't even feel relief. I just felt still. The same kind of stillness that settles over a frozen pond before the first crack spiderwebs through its surface. I didn't ask for details. Nadine promised she would handle every step. My task was simple: remain steady, stay quiet, and do nothing impulsive. The process was in motion. The gears were turning exactly as they should. Later that afternoon, I sat at my small dining table, fingertips resting on the rim of a teacup gone cold. Through the window, sunlight broke briefly through weeks of heavy grey, and a single ray reached across the floor to warm my hands. For a moment, I simply let it sit there. Warmth against skin that had spent too long in the cold. Outside, snow began melting into small rivulets that ran down the sidewalk, thin streams glinting like mercury. Life was continuing, even as something old and painful was finally being dragged into the open. That evening, a message arrived from an unknown number, brief, clipped, without greeting. Your neighbours are talking. What are you doing to us? No name! But the number belonged to Bradley. He hadn't spoken to me directly since that night, not since my blood stained his kitchen tile. I didn't answer. I simply forwarded the message to Nadine. She told me she'd add it to the case documentation, another stitch in the legal fabric forming around the truth. That night, I went walking through the city streets near the courthouse. Snowmelt turned to thin ice beneath the streetlights. I passed the same legal office that had turned me away months ago, when I'd first come in bruised, trembling and without counsel. They hadn't even offered me a consultation back then. Just a sympathetic nod and a hotline number. Now I walked past that same doorway without bitterness. I didn't need them. I had Nadine. I had evidence. I had my own voice. And it was finally being recorded. Back home, I reviewed the timeline, not because I doubted my memory, but because I wanted to feel the progress made visible, the fall, the silence, the lack of apology. The first email to Nadine, the video retrieval, the quiet filing, the legal letters, the pushback, the showcase, Marcus's call, the foundation launch, the hearing date, all small steps that together built something unbreakable. Nothing about justice had been quick, but every piece mattered. The next morning, Nadine called again. The officers had visited the house. They'd walked the rooms. They had spoken to neighbours. One of them, Mrs. Kendall, 2 doors down, had given a sworn statement. She said she saw me that night, leaving with a torn coat and blood on my sleeve. She said she'd been afraid to speak before, afraid of stirring up neighbourhood tension, afraid of being involved. But after the footage surfaced, fear no longer outweighed truth. Her testimony changed everything. Now, the district's legal review was considering elevating the case to include formal charges, not just assault, but endangerment and evidence concealment. They had waited too long to call it an accident. They had buried the truth too deliberately. That weekend, I visited the Montreux Initiative's office. A new ivory plaque had been installed, the organisation's name etched in raised silver letters, shining softly in the winter light. The front desk was now manned by a young woman, no more than 23, interning while studying nursing. She greeted me with an eager smile, unaware of who I was. I told her gently that I preferred to walk alone, and she nodded, respectful and curious, room by room. I moved through the space, shelves lined with books, boxes of resources waiting to be shipped to senior centres, a stack of applications from women proposing wellness workshops in rural towns. Each paper, each plan felt like a small act of reclamation. In the conference room, I paused and ran my hand along the edge of the table. From the window, sunlight poured across the polished wood. I sat down, alone, and thought, a life can look ordinary on paper, but the choices that define it often happen quietly, without witnesses. Like sitting in a courtroom not as the accused, but as the witness. Like hearing your son's name spoken by a judge. Like knowing you didn't raise your voice, but you raised the truth. As I left, the sun dipped behind the trees, shadows lengthening across the snow. On the drive home, Nadine called again, another update. Juliana's lawyer had filed a sealed motion requesting early mediation, voluntary, private, a last attempt to avoid charges. It meant one thing: they were scared. I pulled my car to the roadside and rolled down the window. The cold air rushed in, stinging but clean. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I just felt awake, truly awake for the first time in a long time. The court date wasn't loud. No cameras, no press, no crowds, just a small courtroom on the second floor of the county building, its windows overlooking a row of skeletal trees stripped bare for winter. The air smelled faintly of paper, old carpet, and the slow heat of radiators. I arrived 10 minutes early, navy slacks, dark sweater, my late husband's watch on my wrist. Not for sentiment, but as a reminder of the years I'd carried everything quietly while everyone else leaned on me. Today wasn't about memory. It was about ownership. Nadine was already there, her briefcase open, files arranged neatly like rows of armour. Her calm steadiness filled the space more than any speech could. Across the aisle, Bradley sat rigid beside his lawyer. The suit he wore didn't fit, maybe borrowed, maybe just outdated. He glanced up once, caught my eye, then looked away. Juliana entered a few minutes later, dressed in black, no jewellery, Not even her wedding ring. She didn't sit beside him. She took the back row, arms folded across her chest, shoulders stiff. Then the judge entered, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled tight and a voice like snapping wood. She didn't waste words. She opened the file, called the room to order and began. The clerk read the charges aloud. First, misdemeanor elder abuse. Second, obstruction of reporting. Third, attempted coercion of property through emotional manipulation. Each line dropped into the air like a small weight, steady and deliberate. I didn't look at Bradley. I didn't need to. Then came the evidence presentation. Nadine stood, composed, precise, and signalled for the monitor to be rolled in. The video played in silence. I had only watched it once before, alone in that motel room. Now, I watched it again, surrounded by the very people who had tried to deny it. Bradley's arm moved across the frame, my body staggered back, glass burst, snow, silence, the aye. Video ended. No gasps, no words. Just a room that suddenly forgot how to breathe. Even the judge sat motionless for a long moment before writing something on her pad and nodding for the next statement. Nadine spoke with the same calm authority that first drew me to her. No embellishment. No theatrics, just facts and my injury. The reporting delays. The manipulation attempts. The suspicious asset transfers Bradley had attempted weeks before the incident. She called it a pattern. Subtle but unmistakable. Bradley's attorney countered with excuses. Stress, miscommunication, family tension, misunderstanding, unintentional harm. He painted a portrait of a son overwhelmed, of a mother misinterpreting help. His words fell like dust, thin, weightless, transparent. Then Juliana was asked if she wished to speak. Her lawyer leaned close. She shook her head. No words. Her silence was the loudest sound she'd ever made. The judge didn't take long. No sentencing. This was only an evidentiary hearing, but she ruled decisively. The case would proceed. The evidence was sufficient. The protective order would be extended. Bradley and Juliana were forbidden from contacting me. Directly or indirectly, their joint financial accounts were frozen pending audit. The wheels of accountability were turning. When the gavel came down, I didn't sigh or smile. I simply stood, nodded to Nadine, and walked out. The hallway felt long and bright. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves scraped along the pavement, whispering against the courthouse steps. Each step I took felt earned. At a cafe nearby, I ordered a small black coffee, sat at the corner table, and opened my notebook. I crossed out the day's date, then wrote one sentence: I am not broken. When I returned home that evening, a letter was waiting in the mail slot. Not email, not typed, a handwritten envelope. It was from Bradley. The handwriting was unsteady, as if his hand shook through each line. He wrote that he was sorry, that he'd been under stress, that he didn't mean for things to go this far. He asked me to remember the boy he used to be. I read it twice, then folded it once and slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk, not from anger, not from spite, but because forgiveness is a process, not a performance. That night, I sat by the window in the dark. No tears, no smiles, just the still hum of quiet victory, the kind that doesn't need to be declared. The house they tried to take was back under my name, the deed, restored, the will updated, the foundation, recognised by the state as a non-profit entity. We had our first official board meeting scheduled in 2 weeks. Lives would change, not out of revenge, but because I could make them change. That's power. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that builds. I sat on the edge of the guest bed in my new apartment, the letter still tucked away in the drawer across the room. I hadn't touched it again since the night it arrived. But I'd thought about it. Not the words he'd written, but the words he'd avoided. The things left unsaid were always louder than apologies. All those years, I'd let silence do the talking. I'd let myself shrink, become smaller to keep peace in rooms that had no space for me. I'd let them interrupt, correct, condescend, and smooth over my truth with soft smiles and polite dismissal. Not because I didn't know better, but because I'd convinced myself that love required surrender. That harmony meant holding my tongue. That peace was worth the price of being unseen. That day in court, when he couldn't look me in the eye, I finally understood the shape of what I had created. I had raised a son not in courage, but in quiet fear, not the kind that screams, but the kind that whispers, "Don't make waves. Don't push too hard. Don't disappoint." I had taught him, unintentionally, that guilt fades when ignored, that sorry is enough when followed by silence, that forgiveness is guaranteed no matter the damage, but that was done now. He would face his consequences, and I would face myself. I rose and walked to the window. Outside, snow was falling again, soft and pale under the glow of the street lamp. The city didn't stop moving, but it moved quietly, as if it understood I needed the stillness. For the first time in years, the tightness in my chest was gone, not replaced with joy, but with something steadier at release. The next morning, I dressed for something that mattered, a community roundtable hosted by the Montreux Initiative. We met in a small rented hall inside a public library just outside Denver. Dozens of women came, some alone, some with daughters, some clutching worn notebooks full of postponed dreams. At first, their voices trembled as they spoke, soft confessions of loss, of being unseen, of starting over. But as the morning grew, their voices steadied, grew louder, stronger. They began to echo one another, nodding, smiling, understanding. There was something sacred in the way they listened. No competition. No judgment. Just shared ache and recognition. During the short break, a woman named Felicia sat beside me. She was 65, recently divorced. Her son living across the country and calling only on holidays. Her eyes were kind but tired. She told me she'd once believed that invisibility was the natural cost of aging, that fading was inevitable, that it was simply the way life went, but lately, she said, she wasn't so sure anymore. I told her that I used to mistake silence for strength too, that I believed endurance without complaint was virtue. She smiled, soft and wry. Then maybe, she said, it's time we rewrite what strength looks like. Her words stayed with me the entire evening. After the event, I walked slowly to my car. Outside, twilight had stretched long shadows across the library's brick walls. On the corner, a small independent bookstore glowed warm behind frosted windows. A sign in the window read, "Local authors reading, next Saturday." I smiled without stopping. It wasn't about being seen anymore. It was about finally seeing myself clearly. When I got home, I brewed tea, chamomile with honey, and opened a fresh notebook. I didn't plan to journal. I just wanted to feel the texture of paper again, to hear the faint scratch of a pen on the page. It reminded me of the notes I used to tuck into Bradley's lunchbox when he was a boy. Short sentences in blue ink. "You've got this. I believe in you. You're stronger than you think." Now, decades later, I found myself writing those same words, but to me. The next morning, Marcus called. The audits were complete. Every attempt Bradley and Juliana had made to interfere with my assets had failed. The fraudulent requests, the disguised inquiries, the forged authorizations filed weeks before the incident, all uncovered, all blocked, all traceable. Marcus's voice held a quiet satisfaction, the sound of precision paying off, but he also told me something. Unexpected, a law student working under his Mentorship wanted to take my case further, not for punishment, but for precedent. She said my story, my footage, and the years of silence around it could become a model case, proof of how subtle and systemic elder coercion often goes unseen until it's too late. She wanted to research it, publish it, talk about it, bring it into classrooms and policy discussions. I said yes. Not because I wanted my name in a headline, but because I wanted women like me, the quiet ones, the patient ones, to know they weren't imagining it. They weren't alone. That same week, news came that Juliana's name had been formally removed. From 2 properties she'd tried to leverage for personal loans, the bank had reversed the filings. She had no legal claim. Bradley's accounts remained frozen pending review, his access restricted until further notice. The judge had scheduled a restitution hearing for financial accountability, and yet I didn't feel triumph. Not really. What I felt was something calmer, wider. Like space clearing after a long storm. I wasn't climbing toward revenge. I was walking into peace. That weekend I returned to Aspen, back to the mountains, to the cabin I'd once rented in secret. The snow was lighter this time, not sharp, just gentle, like the world was exhaling. I walked the same trails I had months before, only now my steps were different, not hurried, not escaping, returning. At the ridge overlooking the valley, I stopped. The light was dipping gold through the trees, the air smelled of cedar and thaw. I closed my eyes and thought about that night, the shattering glass, the sting of betrayal, the unbearable quiet afterward. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, I said the words I'd needed for years. You didn't deserve that. Not the push, not the neglect, not the years of being dismissed, spoken over, or remembered only when needed. Not the shrinking, not the silence. You didn't deserve it, I repeated, softer this time, and it felt like the air itself heard me. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years. No nightmares, no echoes. Just peace. It was never about revenge. It was about reclamation, about taking back the voice I had buried under decades of endurance. And now that it had surfaced, I wasn't going to let it drown again. The following Monday, I arrived early at the Foundation's headquarters. Snowflakes drifted lazily through grey light. Inside, the Montreux Initiative had grown since our first meeting. The walls were no longer bare. They were lined with photographs of the women we had already helped. Smiling faces, training certificates, business permits, thank you letters from daughters who'd watched their mothers begin again. In the main hall, our new program coordinator, a young woman named Lily, was setting up tables for a skills workshop. She glanced up, smiled politely and kept working. That small, ordinary gesture moved me more than she could know. She didn't treat me like something fragile. She didn't tiptoe around me. She saw me as part of the work. Nothing more. Nothing less. I passed through the hallway into the room we called the Founders' Room. In the drawer of the desk waited a sealed packet, the final set of documents I had been holding on to. Inside was the last transfer, the remaining sum of my assets, the total of $21 million, officially and permanently placed under the Trust's control. When I saw the figure written out, the zeros stretching across the page, I didn't feel pride, I felt closure, because it wasn't about wealth anymore. It was about what survived after it. I read the line that mattered most, printed near the bottom of the page. Permanent designated use. Empowerment of older women in transition. I uncapped my pen and signed. Slowly, deliberately, each stroke felt like a farewell, not to the money, but to the version of myself that had once been afraid to acknowledge her own worth. When I finished, I set the pen down and let my hand rest for a moment over my name. That evening, I drove to my old neighbourhood one last time. The house, my house, now belonged to a retired couple from Oregon. They didn't know Bradley or Juliana. They'd been told the sale was delayed due to probate. Nothing more. They hadn't asked for details. They simply wanted peace and quiet near the trails. From across the street, I sat in my car with the engine running, watching through the windshield as the porch. Light flickered on. Wind chimes swayed gently. Under the eaves, a faint line still marked the frame of the new glass door, the place where the old one had splintered. Didn't need to walk closer. That story had already been written as I turned to leave. My phone buzzed, a text from Nadine. Final judgment issued. Bradley had been placed under restricted financial access for 5 years, mandatory counselling ordered for abusive conduct toward a vulnerable adult. Juliana had agreed to a full settlement, relinquishing all shared claims and withdrawing her appeal. No trial. No headlines, just signatures and silence, and just like that, it was over. I didn't cheer, I didn't cry. I simply sat for a long while, watching snow fall against the windshield, until it blurred the world outside. There were no explosions. At the end of this story, just quiet. Consequence. The kind that doesn't scream but settles where it belongs. When I returned home that night, I opened the windows and let the winter air in. It smelled like closure, sharp but clean. In the weeks that followed, I rarely thought of Bradley, not because I wanted to erase him, but because the version of him I had carried, the father, the son, the man, no longer lived in my memory the same way. He would live his life under the weight of his own actions. And I would live mine in lightness. Peace. Clarity. Purpose. At our next staff meeting, one of the interns, a bright young woman named Naomi, asked me how we decide who receives support. I told her we look for women who remind us of who we used to be, not because we want to save them, but because we want to stand beside them while they learn to save themselves. She smiled and nodded, and I knew she understood. That evening, I sat by my window again with pen in hand, not to write a letter, just to mark the day. On the blank page, I wrote one line. Justice isn't always loud, but when it's real, it doesn't need to be. Then I underlined it, once, slowly. The lake behind my apartment froze over in early January. For weeks, I had watched it transform, ripples stilling, surface glazing, reflections turning to silence. That morning, I walked the trail around it, coffee cup in gloved hand, scarf snug against the cold. The air bit at my cheeks, but it didn't sting like it used to. It felt alive. We'd just concluded the last board meeting of the quarter. The Montreux initiative had helped more than 200 women since autumn. Training programs, housing assistance, small business grants. Some had found work again, some had started over. One woman, Donna, 72, had begun her own bookkeeping service after decades of unpaid caregiving. I remembered the way her hands shook as she showed me her first checks. I thought life was finished with me, she'd said, laughing through tears. Turns out I just needed a second wind. At the far side of the lake, I stopped by a bench beneath an old willow tree. I sat, breathing the crisp air, watching sunlight scatter across the ice. Once, I would have felt restless, driven to prove, to perform, to justify my presence. Now, I understood that stillness wasn't invisibility, and strength didn't mean silence. My phone buzzed. A message from Nicole, my granddaughter. A photo. A pencil sketch of a woman sitting at a window, cup in hand, watching the snow. Underneath, she'd written, "I remember you like this." I didn't reply. Not yet. My heart was too full, not with grief, but with something heavier and softer. Forgiveness. Not forgiveness for Bradley or Juliana. That was theirs to earn. Forgiveness for myself. For all the years I'd believed that value was measured by how much pain I could endure without complaint. I rose, walked back slowly, each step crunching against the snow. At the door, I turned one last time to look at the frozen lake, then went inside and shut the world gently behind me. Later that night, I packed a small suitcase, not for a trip exactly, just a few quiet days at the cabin near Aspen, the one I'd bought quietly and restored in peace. My place. My space. Before leaving, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back didn't startle me like she once had. The lines around her eyes had deepened. The grey in her hair had thickened, but the eyes themselves, they were clear, steady, alive. I whispered softly to the glass. You kept going, and I smiled, because I had, through betrayal. Through doubt. Through long, aching silence. Through the endless nights wondering whether I'd imagined it all. Whether I was too much or never enough, but I had been enough all along, I just needed to remember. And now, I had, if you've ever chosen silence because no one would listen, if you've ever been dismissed or forgotten by those you love, then this story was for you. Share how it made you feel. You never know. Your words might be the light someone else needs while walking through their own darkness. We read every comment, even the quietest ones, because this isn't just a storytelling channel, it's where silence is finally heard.